Welcome back, folks, to the third round in our Chapter 10 lecture series, this one entitled Nation, Section, and Party. The focus question for this section is, what were the major areas of conflict between nationalism and sectionalism? In the early 19th century, the tide of revolutions that began in the United States spread across the Atlantic to France and then spread back across the Atlantic to Haiti, emerged in Latin America as well. Between 1810 and 1822, most Latin American countries revolted and secured their independence from Spain. These revolutions resulted from Spanish attempts to reassert more centralized control of the colonies, very similar to issues that initiated the struggle between the United States and Britain. Americans generally sympathize and empathize with these Latin American revolutions. They saw it as a natural continuation of the ethos of the American Revolution. Latin American declarations of independence and the new constitutions that emerged in many of these countries were modeled very specifically on the United States example. Many of them, however, were more democratic than the United States example. They extended the vote to free blacks and Native Americans as well as white men. The emergence of independent Latin American states led to a realignment of American diplomatic policy towards the rest of the world on the global stage. And this was exemplified by the Monroe Doctrine, so named because it emerged during James Monroe's presidency, but it really was the brainchild of John Quincy Adams, who was Monroe's Secretary of State, as well as the son of former President and Founding Father John Adams. The United States feared that Spain would try to reclaim its lost colonial possessions in the Western Hemisphere. And the United States also wanted to establish itself as the dominant power and influence throughout the Western Hemisphere. The United States said, according to the Monroe Doctrine, that it would oppose any attempt by any European power to further colonize the Western Hemisphere. In return, the United States promised to stay out of European affairs. The U.S., also fearful of growing British power and commerce in the Western Hemisphere, claimed the rights of commerce in the Western Hemisphere for itself. Basically, the Monroe Doctrine declared that the U.S. was ready, willing, and able to compete at the global level. And this inspired a new sense of nationalism as well, even though in truth the U.S. was nowhere near powerful enough, especially militarily or economically, to really back up most of these claims at this time. The election of 1824 brought the so-called era of good feelings to a crashing end. In 1824, there was still only one main party in the country, the Democratic Republicans, but that party was fractured by sectionalism that was fully revealed during the debates and the controversy over the Missouri Compromise. 4 candidates ran in this election, but only one, Andrew Jackson, thanks to his military victories, particularly in the Battle of New Orleans at the end of the War of 1812, had widespread national support. Jackson got the most popular votes, but he did not win enough electoral votes to secure the presidency. John Quincy Adams and Jackson were the top 2 in the running in the election at that time. The election ended up in the House of Representatives, where there was an incident that became known as the corrupt bargain. Henry Clay, who also was one of the 4 candidates that ran for president, but he was also Speaker of the House through his support behind John Quincy Adams, even though Jackson, again, remember, had won the majority of the popular vote. And in return, after his election, Adams appointed Clay Secretary of State, leading many to cry foul and call that there was some sort of corrupt deal between Adams and Clay in exchange for this office. So the corrupt bargain really fractured the Democratic-Republican Party even further, leading to some ramifications that we shall soon see. The presidency of John Quincy Adams further exacerbated those existing sectional divisions among the Democratic-Republican Party. Adams, along with his Secretary of State, Henry Clay, strongly supported that American system that we spoke about at the beginning of Lecture 1. He believed that American greatness hinged on foreign trade and American influence and power in the Western Hemisphere. He held the view of federal power as more expansive than previous Democratic-Republican office holders. And his more progressive sort of ideas faced backlash from more conservative members of Congress and of the Democratic-Republican Party, particularly those strict constructionists who really viewed a limited and very delineated interpretation of the U.S. Constitution and favored very limited federal government. Very few of his programs or proposals were backed in Congress, and really not many new policies were actually put in place by Adams during his presidency. But it did, again, further grow that divide between and amongst the Democratic Republicans. The more progressive sort of ideas of John Quincy Adams, as well as ire over that corrupt bargain between Adams and Clay in the election of 1824, led to the formation of a new party to oppose him and his supporters, the Democratic Party. Now, the face of this new Democratic Party was Andrew Jackson, who was still pretty bent out of shape after having lost the election of 1824 to that corrupt bargain in the House of Representatives. But the real brains behind this new Democratic Party was Martin Van Buren. Now, these new Democrats supported individual liberty, states' rights, and limited government. That was the foundation of their platform. And Van Buren theorized that a strong two-party system, organized political parties, provided a check on those in power and could combat sectionalism by bringing together supporters and candidates from across geographic and social boundaries. This really redefined the importance of parties in American politics, something that had heretofore been kind of accepted but generally frowned upon. Now it became more of an integral part of the American governmental system itself. Van Buren and the Democratic Party initiated a new era of party politics. They were the first party to really be highly organized at the national, state, and local level. And the election of 1828 has been seen by many historians as really the first modern American political campaign that had organized rallies and speeches, pamphlets, newspapers, parades, all of the sorts of things that we have come today to naturally associate with highly competitive elections. Things that go after the vote of your average, everyday American voter. And this was facilitated because by 1828, the presidential election in most states allowed voters to cast votes for electors. These electors were no longer appointed by state legislatures. This further democratize American politics. And the election of 1828 was really the first national presidential election that had widespread voter participation in a majority of the states. Jackson was a clear favorite of the people, your average, everyday, ordinary American, that for the first real true time in American politics was highly engaged at that national level. Jackson exemplified that ethos of the self-made man. He was from the frontier, raised in, less well-to-do sorts of circumstances, and was able to rise through the ranks of American society to the highest echelons of American society. Of course, his military success facilitated much of that rise. The election of 1828 and the rise of Andrew Jackson illustrated how universal white male suffrage transformed American politics. No longer was it really the domain primarily of the elites. Now it was more participatory across a wider swath of the American public. That does it for part 3 of our Chapter 10 lecture series. As always, study hard, and I'll see you soon.